Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and I got something interesting for y'all today. Obviously, we've had a lot of videos this week, but I couldn't help but record something on this. There is a report from, this is Walter Football, Charlie Campbell posting this, about the Jaguars apparently having Kenneth Grant higher than Mason Graham on their big board. Now, before we get into this, before we hear this is ridiculous, this is impossible, or wow, I can't believe this is true, we have to take everything the way we should, right? We shouldn't just 100% buy into everything we hear, and we also shouldn't just discount immediately, right? And I've tried to do some research into this, and I think there might be a little bit of something to this for the Jaguars. At the same time, there is obviously the context that you got to bring into this, right? Because we are putting out a report like this before the Jaguars have officially hired a GM, right? It's sort of like, there's two accounts that I follow on Twitter for Jaguars insider news, right? And you all probably follow them too. It's Dilla and it's Yardline Yoda. Now, Dilla's been around for a long time, and I think it's really easy to kind of understand like what to take seriously and what not. And he's been very good at understanding, really how to balance it, not to rush things or come to sweeping conclusions early. And I take a lot of his stuff very seriously. It's very rare that I disagree with something that Dilla puts out or think, oh, there's no way that's going to happen, right? That's generally where I'm at. With Yardline Yoda's account, it's newer, right? And this is an account that has rushed things recently. I think that's kind of part of it, when you have inside sources. And there's things he's also posted that have been legitimate for the Jaguars. So you have to find the balance, right? And so, for example, like, it was posted by his account that Ian Cunningham was the next general manager. This was done before the Jaguars were even searching for a general manager. So we may not take that as 100% gospel, right? We have to take things in the context of what's going on, what's being reported, and how realistic is it. And so my point in saying all that, it's not to talk up or to rag on any of those people. It's just kind of the way I look at it. But you have to bring this into the conversation with Walter Football, because Walter Football has had some legit hits in the past. They actually predicted the Jaguars' second-round pick last year with Mason Graham. We'll talk as well about what they had for the first round for the Jaguars. It was really close. But that gives them some credibility. They've also had some hits where, not hits, they've had some misses where they've just been completely wrong on like who a team preferred, right? Or a source they had basically just gave them the wrong information. So, point is, before we jump into some of this, that things can be, you can think something's true and it can end up being false. You can think something's for sure false, it can end up being true. Context is important. And the context with this is that Walter Football has been hit and miss in the past, but with the Jaguars, they've actually been pretty good, I would say. Pretty spot on. But we'll get into this. So, this is part of the report, talking about Kenneth Grant. There's a little bit more to it. The first part of this, and this is the article, this is Senior Bowl Hot Press Friday. This is from a week ago. So you have some stuff actually about Tyler Booker. I found this interesting in here, just about as far as like where he could go. There's talk about Seattle maybe being the team at pick number 18, where they're thinking he's going to go 15 to 25. So I always like reading into that stuff, because if it's true, it kind of helps you plan for maybe where you're going to take players and that sort of thing. But the Jacksonville side of this, it's all here. So last year, it was about, are the Jaguars going to take a wide receiver or a cornerback? And obviously, they went in the direction of selecting Brian Thomas Jr. And so, as he writes here, this year cornerback is in play, according to team sources. And they don't expect Hunter to fall, which I would agree with. I think it's sort of, I don't know the order of the top four, but it's sort of clear who's probably going to go. It's probably going to be Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, and it's going to be Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter. And to me, if any of those things don't happen, if a quarterback falls, you're trading out of 5 with a team that wants a quarterback. If Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter fall, you're selecting them at 5 because you can find a way to get them on the field, and they're easily the BPA in my mind. So that's sort of how I look at it, and it kind of leaves things wide open at 5 if those players are gone, but I think those players will be gone. And so Jacksonville is looking at Will Johnson because of this, which makes a lot of sense. Now, I've also heard with Will Johnson that there's some medical stuff popping up, and people had some concerns from film in 2024. We'll see if that's legit, because sometimes this stuff gets talked up, and it's sort of to try to push a player down the board with teams hoping they can land them later. You know, maybe this would be something like, for example, the New Orleans Saints would be big fans of, because if he falls to 9, that's a steal, right? That's a great draft pick. So sometimes there's smoke in that regard, but him being a candidate for Jacksonville is absolutely logical here. Now, it also says that a defensive lineman is a possibility for Jacksonville. And this is interesting to me because defensive line, as far as the interior, I think the defensive tackles are fine on this team, unless you're going to move someone. You know, Eric Armstead and Mason Smith, I think, is a really good combo. I wouldn't be too concerned having to add to that. But with that said, what you really don't have on this team, and I know Devon Hamilton exists, but what you don't have at a high level is a nose tackle. The Jaguars, in addition, were not a team that they weren't a team that was dominant against the run. They were arguably worse than average last year. PFF had them ranked 22nd in the NFL against the run. So you look at what Liam Cohen wants to do. Part of what he was talking about was we want to start with being able to run the football and being able to stop the run. So this is a big part of it, right? This would make sense from that regard. And so they say the preference is towards Michigan defensive tackle Kenneth Grant. Now, this is interesting because I think Kenneth Grant could be a great first-round pick for a team. He should not be a top 5 football player in this draft. So that's where I'm kind of curious as far as how this goes. And it also talks, making it sort of clear as if this is a top 5 prospect for the Jaguars. I think it's possible he could be 3rd or 4th on their board if the quarterbacks are lower. But you look at this, they say they like both Grant and Mason Graham, but they lean towards Grant. They feel that he's not elite as a pass rusher, but he's elite as a run defender, and that's where he puts himself above what Mason Graham would bring. As far as what Jacksonville would need, even though you could very easily argue, I think rushing the passer from the interior is more valuable than stopping the run. It's going to be harder to get a good pass rusher from the interior than a good run defender. It also says here, though, the offensive line could have been in play, but they don't feel there is an offensive lineman worthy of top 5 pick in this draft class. I agree. A lot can change for the Jaguars in the months to come. New general manager along with the new coaching staff, but the initial inclination is to address a cornerback or defensive lineman. And I like that they add that because a lot can change, and a lot does change for these teams. But this is the line here where they say they don't think someone's worth a top 5 pick in this class from the offensive line. That gets me wondering if this is all true, if Kenneth Grant is like an extremely high player on their board. And with who's in charge, right? Just right now, I could buy this. I'm not going to sit here and say it's true, right? I can't say that. That'd be pretty unfair. But you think of who's in charge for the moment. Whose scouts are on this team, right? It's Trent Baalke's guys that are still here, right? And they'll reevaluate that after the draft because they got to go through the entire cycle. And it's Ethan Waugh as an interim GM who has worked under Trent Baalke for much of his career. So probably going to align very well with what Baalke was looking for. Hate that I even have to say his name, by the way. But it would make sense to me if Jacksonville was looking for this type of player. Now, my issue, of course, is this is way too high. You don't draft a nose tackle at 5th overall. And I know that Kenneth Grant is more than a nose tackle, right? This is someone who actually has the upside to rush the passer. He's a freak athlete. My comparison for him in this class, I don't have it showing here, I've hit it, but it's Jordan Davis. I think he's a very similar type of prospect to him, just very athletically gifted for a 6'3.5", 342-pound nose tackle. So, I mean, that's really exciting as far as what he could bring. Now, you also see the difference here, right? I have Mason Graham at 6. I have Kenneth Grant at 16. There is a disparity. But with that said, as far as the grades, it's just an A versus an A+. It's not crazy far off for me. This is probably where a lot of people would land. Maybe they have an A- on Kenneth Grant instead. But that's kind of where I sit with these players. Now, as far as whether or not this is credible, or just kind of the previous history from Walter Football regarding the Jaguars, I'll show you that just as far as the last draft. You also can read down here if you want to see more stuff regarding the draft. They talk a little bit about Harold Fannin, some teams that maybe didn't interview well, so maybe you see them drop. There's some good stuff in it. I mean, if it's legit, and I do think that some of what Walter Football puts out is legit. I don't think it's just all bullcrap, right? It's figuring out what is going to hit and what's going to miss is more the question. But it's good if you want to kind of get some like insight on what might be happening in the draft. But we go back to 2024. This was their prediction for the Jaguars. And they also list other possibilities here, which is important. And this is really spot on as far as where the Jaguars were heading. Now I know, they didn't pick Terrion Arnold. Right? They passed on it. Well, the pick came down to 2 players. That's the report. It was Brian Thomas Jr. and Terrion Arnold. And I think if Jacksonville had everything go the way that they wanted in the offseason, right, and it wouldn't have been good for the team, but say that they had kept Calvin Ridley, that they had worked out the contract and he was back. I think this was the plan for the Jaguars, was to bring in Terrion Arnold, a man coverage cornerback, super athletic, that could play the scheme and lock it down opposite of Tyson Campbell. So, I mean, it makes sense, right? But these were the top 2 players that they had for this pick. It was Terrion Arnold and Brian Thomas Jr. Both players were the top 2 for Jacksonville as well. And the third one listed here is Quinyon Mitchell, who we did hear some stuff about. It wasn't like, I don't know if he would have been the next pick. Of course, he was gone at 22 before the Jaguars did eventually select. But ultimately, I think this is really close. And then we can go down. Let's go to round 2 here. It's funny, I actually got the Chiefs pick right there, but it was a whole round off. Here's Jacksonville's pick 48. This is what I was talking about with Mason Smith. This was their prediction. I didn't see this anywhere else at any point in the draft process, and they got it right. So Jacksonville, they nailed last year as far as what they were going to do. I don't know about 96. I'm actually just going to check out of curiosity here. I doubt this one was correct. Yeah, Tez Walker, which they did have some interest in him, it sounded like. So, I mean, not crazy far off. And then Jermaine Burton actually goes to the right team here. But let's go look at something else here from this draft. Because my point is, there's hits and there's misses. And this is where maybe this source is wrong. Things could change, right? It's not just a matter of a new GM might feel differently and sway the room. You know, it could also be that the source is incorrect. So you have Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, right? It's all right. Vikings straight up for J.J. McCarthy. Now, I wouldn't have done it at 4. Like, I think this was probably pretty unlikely. Would have been extremely aggressive by the Vikings to move up this early for it. So I wouldn't really agree with this, but that's what he predicted. And the Vikings, everyone thought they were trading up. That was well known around the league. And then they only moved up 1 spot, and they played hardball, and they won because of it. They got to pick again in the first round. They moved up with that pick to get Dallas Turner. Now, here's what's interesting. This line right here. this is one of their other possibilities, right? They thought the Cardinals would trade back, was the top thing, which was wrong. They said the Vikings pulled the offer and no one else wanted to trade up for the fourth best QB. The Cardinals would take Malik Nabers, whom they prefer over Marvin Harrison Jr. And then, according to Mike Jurecki, so that's wrong, right? And you see here at number 5, J.C. Latham over Joe Alt, getting these picks flipped because then they have Joe Alt go to Tennessee. So kind of on the right track as far as position, but doesn't get the player right. So as far as what they've heard, because you see a source listed, right? This is not like just a guess, right? It's clear if it's a guess or if it's a source. This was wrong as far as what they thought was going to happen. They thought Malik Nabers was the top guy for the Cardinals. It was Marvin Harrison Jr. So my point is, when they report this, this could be true. This could be false. But what I can confidently say to you is that we don't have a GM. There's time for these things to change. The scouts will stay the same until the draft, and then they'll change after that. They might bring in some guys, or people might move on. Like, it's always possible. But ultimately, there is a lot of infrastructure that will stay here, that will feel the same way about the draft. And especially if you get a guy like James Gladstone, who has been a part of a team that heavily valued the scouting input for their draft picks. Like, they literally had voting on who they wanted in the first round, which led to Jared Verse being their guy. I could see this sticking around past the GM hype. Just my thoughts on it. But it was really interesting. I wanted to report on this because I think it's fun to talk about the draft, of course, but whenever we hear these little tidbits about how a team feels and stuff, I think it's worth noting. And we'll have to see if they come true, and then you remember that for the future, right? Because if they just completely botch this, then, you take that into account for the future. But what I will say, at least, is whether or not the Jaguars pick Kenneth Grant, I do think he'll go early in the draft. I think he's going to be sooner rather than later in the first round. So there's some logic there. But if the Jaguars actually felt this way and this ended up being true through the process, Liam Cohen agreed with it, and that's what they wanted to do, I think that they got to be very careful about how high they select him. Try to get something out of it if you can trade down, but it's a hard class to trade down in. So with that all said, we are going to wrap this up. Want to shout out our channel members, Premier Desir 904, Nightmare Eco, Gator John Bites, Scrubber Ducky 500, and Mogar. I appreciate all your support, guys. It's been a great last couple weeks, actually having hope as a Jaguars fan. That's not normal, but I think we're going to have this for a while, especially seeing some of the air hires they've made. So thank you all for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.